Thank you very much. I'd like to start with a miracle. But since I'm not at the level where I can instantaneously manifest them, I would instead invite you to envision a miraculous situation. So please just imagine that at the snap of my fingers, there's a worldwide wave of illumination through which every person on Earth becomes fully aware of all the relevant facts about genetically engineered foods, and everybody's opinion about them becomes fully aligned with our best scientific knowledge. What do you think would happen? Well, if we adhere to the routine rhetoric of the proponents of these products, we would have to predict that such a global wave of enlightenment would cause all opposition to them to vanish. Because in the rendition of reality that they propound, all of the opposition is based on ignorance of the facts and based on irrational, unscientific fears. But in the world we actually inhabit, such a universal wave of enlightenment would not cause the opposition to the foods to vanish. What would vanish would be the foods themselves. That's right. If people actually understood all of the facts about genetically engineered food, and if their opinions became aligned with sound science, solid science, then this whole massive venture to reconfigure the genetic core of the world's food supply would collapse quite quickly. And that is why, despite their pretensions to want to educate the public about the facts, the proponents of these products, whether in industry or in scientific institutions or major universities, go out of their way to suppress the facts and to distort the facts and to keep the public in the dark about them. And they've been very successful in doing that. Now, during the next 50 minutes or so, I am going to be sharing with you extensive information that will help clear up many of the key distortions, many of the key deceptions that have been propagated in the name of science, and it will allow you to gain a firmer understanding, clear up a lot of the confusion. And by the end of the presentation, you will see that there are at least 5 basic evidence-supported conclusions that can be reached. So one is that producing new foods through recombinant DNA technology, which is genetic engineering, is an inherently risky process. Second, that every genetically engineered food poses an abnormal level of risk. 3, the safety of those on the market has never been adequately established. And 4, some of them have already been shown to be harmful. That's very important. And last, not only has the GE food venture been shown to be harmful, not only has the GE food venture, I skipped up to the above line, has the GE food venture been violating the standards of science, it has been damaging science and has injured it far more severely than has the campaign to deny global warming. Now, of course, any advocates of genetic engineering who heard me recite these assertions would by now be livid. In fact, they'd probably be standing up and screaming. And the fact that nobody's standing up and screaming, I think, implies that none of you are strong advocates of GMOs. And that 5th assertion would especially rouse their ire, because they claim that the genetic engineering venture is solidly aligned with science, and that anybody who opposes it is in essence anti-science. And they claim that, in fact, the opposition to genetically engineered foods is on a par with the campaign to deny climate science, to deny climate change. And they classify opposition to GMOs as, along with the campaign to deny global warming, as a key component in a major war that's being waged against science. Now, while it is true that science is being badly attacked, severely attacked, in regard to genetically engineered foods, the attack on science in regard to GMOs is very different, diametrically different, than the attack on science in regard to climate change. When it comes to climate change, the attack on science is coming from outside the scientific community. But in the case of GMOs, the attack on science is coming from inside the scientific community. It's an inside job that's especially insidious, and that's because it's being waged. The key people waging it are actually part of the scientific community, and they are acting under the banner of science. My book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, solidly documents this assault on science, this inside assault on science. An assault on science, probably one of the worst that's ever occurred, in the name of science. And it documents there's been systematic twisting of the truth. So the part of that twisting, the deception, is that the process of creating GE foods, and sometimes they'll be referred to as GM foods. So GE stands for genetically engineered. GM stands for genetically modified, not the car manufacturer. The process of creating GE foods has been deceptively described to make it appear much more precise and far less disruptive than it actually is. Concomitantly, natural processes have been falsely described to make them look less precise and more disruptive than they actually are. So, by misrepresenting the GE process as precise and predictable, while portraying natural processes as unnaturally random and unruly, many scientists have induced the false impression that genetic engineering is natural and innocuous. Very false impression. Further, as in further twisting of the truth, false statements have consistently been issued about the tests on genetically engineered foods to cover up the substantial troubling results. What's more, the evidence that demonstrates the distortion of the evidence is solid, and its solidity has been attested by many experts. And my book presents a large amount of this evidence, and the presentation in the book has been praised by many experts. One of them is John Eichard, Professor Emeritus of Agricultural and Applied Economics at the University of Missouri. He stated about the book, "The evidence is comprehensive and irrefutable. No one has documented other cases of irresponsible behavior by government, regulators, and the scientific establishment nearly as well as Druker documents this one." Another expert who has praised the book is David Schubert, a professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and the head of cellular neurobiology there. And he stated that the book is scientifically solid and truly outstanding, and through its masterful marshaling of facts, it dispels the cloud of disinformation that has misled people into believing that GE foods have been adequately tested and don't entail abnormal risks. Now, the irrefutable fact that the facts have been routinely misrepresented is in itself concrete evidence, evidence of how strongly the evidence weighs against the soundness of the GE food venture. Because, after all, it's quite obvious, if the facts are on your side, you're proud of them. You don't want to hide them. You don't want to distort them. You want to bring them out. You want to bring them out in their fullness. It's only when the evidence weighs against your position that you would be tempted to use underhanded means to suppress evidence, to misrepresent evidence. And unfortunately, the very fact that the proponents of genetically engineered foods have been driven to distort the facts so extensively, really since the creation of the first GMO organism, genetically engineered organism, back in the early 1970s, years before, almost a decade before, the technology was able to create the first functional genetically engineered plant, the facts have been misrepresented by eminent scientists and scientific institutions. In fact, the misrepresentations predated the founding of the biotechnology industry, okay? So as my book demonstrates, although many people, when they hear about the distortions and deceptions that are propagated on behalf of GMOs, they think of Monsanto or DuPont or the other major multinational corporations that manufacture them. And clearly, those multinationals have been guilty of many distortions, but they probably wouldn't have invested the millions and millions in developing genetically engineered foods in the first place if the groundwork had not been laid, if the public had not been properly pacified about these, and the governments had been also induced to have a promotional policy by misrepresentations that were propagated by eminent constituents of the scientific establishment. It's very important to understand. So the key deceptions have been disseminated by individuals and organizations operating in the name of science, under the banner of science. And they're probably, most of them, not even aware of the extent to which they have been disfiguring the facts. And for one thing, they pretty much talk to one another. And as we know, if a untruth is repeated often enough and one hears it back from one's peers, one starts to believe it oneself. There's a lot of self-deception that's been going on. And unfortunately, not just self-deception, but deception of government regulators, of the media, and the public. So, also, besides disfiguring the facts, science has been badly attacked, as I said. And in fact, it's very clear that the pro-GMO forces, whether they're scientists or not, even the scientists have been subverting science, because the most fundamental precept of science is that the facts must be honored and honestly communicated. The facts must be honored and honestly communicated. And no matter what somebody's scientific degree or what the pedigree of a scientific organization, that person or that organization cannot represent science if it is consistently misrepresenting the facts. There's just so great a conflict there, they can't coexist. And unfortunately, that's been happening. Just to drive home the importance of adherence to the facts on the part of scientists is a quote from Jacob Bernowski, an eminent scientist and historian of science, in his very influential book, Science and Human Values, emphasized, the science must conform to the facts. The sanction of truth is an exact boundary which encloses him. And Bronowski went on to stress that it's essential for scientists to cultivate what he called the habit of truth. But unfortunately, too many scientists who are advocating genetic engineering and GMOs have fallen into the habit of distorting the truth. And it's a bad habit. Now, one of the foundational falsehoods that is propagated by the scientific community is the claim of scientific consensus. You probably all heard it. The claim that there's an overwhelming consensus within the scientific community that genetically engineered foods are just as safe, if not safer, than conventionally produced foods. And indeed, this consensus is purported to be at least as strong as the scientific consensus that there is global warming occurring and that human activity is playing a significant role in it. But where there always has been a very strong and genuine scientific consensus in the case of global warming and the role of human activity in causing it, there has not been a similar consensus when it comes to GMOs. And several respected scientific organizations and scientists have, from the beginning of the whole venture till the present, issued cautions, criticized the weakness of the regulation, and stood up for it, often against quite a bit of attack from the proponents. Now, in fact, some of these claims about consensus are really bold and absolute. For instance, in 2012, the Board of Directors of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the premier scientific organizations, issued a statement in support of genetically engineered foods, in which they claimed that every respected organization that has reviewed the data has concluded that genetically engineered foods are just as safe, no riskier than their conventionally produced counterparts. But that is a flat-out false statement. And it's surprising they could make it and get away with it because, for one thing, in 2001, Canada's National Academy of Science, the Royal Society of Canada, released a major report in which two of the main conclusions were, one, the default prediction for each GE food should be that the genetic alteration has induced unintended and potentially harmful side effects, and B, it is scientifically unjustifiable to regard a GE food as safe unless its safety has been established through a course of testing that is far more rigorous than any regulators were then requiring or that any have yet to require. Okay, for one thing, they called not only for extensive long-term animal testing, little of which has been done, but then after that, human clinical trials, and there haven't been any of those. Other respected groups that have expressed concerns include the British Medical Association, the editors of The Lancet, a premier medical journal, and in one of their opinion pieces, they stated, there are good reasons to believe that specific risks may exist, and they also stated, government should have never have allowed these products into the food chain without insisting on rigorous testing for effects on health. Now, in 2015, more than 300 scientists signed a statement asserting that there is not a consensus within the scientific community about safety, and that the safety of genetically engineered foods has not been adequately demonstrated. The Public Health Association of Australia, which is that nation's premier non-governmental health association, beginning in 2000, began to release cautionary reports and statements on GMOs and critiques of the way they were being regulated. And most recently in 2016, that association called for an immediate and indefinite freeze on the commercial growing and the importation of GE crops until their safety has been established via long-term testing conducted independently of the manufacturers, something that has not yet happened and is unlikely to happen. Also, interestingly, the scientists on the Biotechnology Task Force of the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, are among the groups of scientists who have not signed on, are not part of the claimed consensus that these foods do not entail unique risks. In fact, as was mentioned in the introduction, a lawsuit that I initiated against the FDA in 1998 forced that agency to divulge its files on genetically engineered food. And that basically unearthed memo after memo from the FDA's own scientific experts that have been asked to study the issue, and those memos warned about the risks. In fact, they were stating essentially what the experts that released the Canadian report stated, because that is the solid scientific understanding when one understands how disruptive, potentially disruptive, the genetic engineering process is and the risks that it imposes. Those scientists warned about the risks, called for rigorous safety testing, and the extent of the concern among the scientific staff of the FDA and the degree of consensus is evidenced by a memo that was written by an FDA compliance officer, Dr. Linda Call, sent to the biotechnology coordinator in 1992. She had been reviewing all the memos, all the input from the scientists, and here's what she stated. The processes of genetic engineering and traditional breeding are different, and according to the technical experts in the agency, they lead to different risks. Now, she didn't say, you know, there's some debate here going on, and some of the scientists have concerns. You wouldn't know. She just said, according to the technical experts, because that was the pervasive opinion. That was that's what you see when you read the memos, as I have. Also, quite interestingly, the FDA's biotechnology coordinator had written a few months before that, had written a letter to a Canadian health official admitting that there was not a consensus about the safety of genetically engineered foods in the general scientific community outside the FDA either. So the FDA administrators knew that within their own ranks, their scientists solidly had concluded that genetic engineering entails abnormal risks and that each food has to be carefully tested, and it knew that there was not a consensus about safety in the scientific community at large. That didn't stop them from going ahead and basically allowing these foods on the market in violation not only of sound science, but in violation of US food safety law, which actually presumes that these foods such as GMOs are unsafe until demonstrated safe through standard scientific procedures. And you might ask, well, why would they do that? Why would they ignore their own scientists? Well, because beginning in 1986 with the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan and continuing through every subsequent federal administration, Republican or Democrat, the FDA and the other federal executive agencies in the US have been following a policy to promote biotechnology and to help ease the introduction of its products onto domestic and foreign markets. And the FDA has admitted in writing that it has a policy to promote biotechnology. So with that conflict of interest, it's a little less surprising that they ignored their own scientists. And here's what the FDA claimed in its official policy statement on genetically engineered foods, issued in May of 1992, but still in effect. This is still the FDA's official stance on genetically engineered foods. The agency, and it stated, among other things, the agency is not aware of any information showing that foods derived by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way, or that, as a class, foods developed by the new techniques present any different or greater safety concern that foods developed by traditional plant breeding. An outright lie. I mean, they're not aware of any information. Their files are loaded with information for their own scientists. So this is the kind of deception that is being dished out on behalf of genetic engineering. And if the lawsuit had not been instigated, we wouldn't really know the extent to which that's a fraudulent statement. We wouldn't know what the FDA's own scientists had said. Now, there's also lack of evidentiary basis on which a genuine consensus, scientific consensus, could have formed. We'll be seeing that as we review the evidence that is accumulated about the risks of genetically engineered foods. And one of the very telling studies that was done, it was a review of 8 scientific reviews that had been performed on genetically engineered foods. It was performed by Sheldon Krimsky, a professor at Tufts University, and it was published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2015. And it was titled, whoops, I was going backwards, excuse me. Here we go. His review article was titled An Illusory Consensus Behind GMO Health Assessment. So right in the title, you can see his main conclusion is there, in fact, here's the key statement, one cannot read these systematic reviews and conclude that the science on health effects of GMOs has been resolved within the scientific community. So not only did he say, not only is it clear that there has never been a scientific consensus, according to Krimsky's analysis, there couldn't have been a genuine one based on the evidence at hand because there's too much evidence of risk. But you would never know that from listening to the claims of the scientists and institutions that promote GMOs. In fact, here's an interesting one. You probably were aware of this, many of you. An open letter was signed by more than 150 Nobel laureates in 2016 and in favor of GMOs, and one of their key assertions was there has never been a single confirmed case of a negative health outcome for humans or animals from their, meaning GE Foods, consumption. Whew. That is baloney coming, from in the name of Nobel laureates. Well, it's a little less surprising when we see that a very large proportion of those Nobel laureates who were induced to sign that statement aren't life scientists at all. Their Nobel Prizes were run in either physics or economics, which certainly doesn't give them the authority to make such statements. They probably haven't reviewed the research. And most of the laureates who signed, who did win their Nobel Prize for medicine or physiology, are not molecular biologists either, not biochemists, probably again don't know the research. There was one Nobel laureate who actually has a key position with a biotechnology company who basically got all these other scientists to sign on and inducing them, telling them that basically science is under attack and this is very important, so he got them to sign on. But look at this, they've sullied their integrity because they signed something they took his word for it, and they were misled, and through that, their letter has misled hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people because this has been well publicized and cited in many newspapers. In fact, it's very interesting. It was publicized to the world at a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and that biologist who organized it all, he was helped at that with a former PR person from Monsanto who was then moved on to having his own PR firm. So it was a propaganda stunt, but it's been very effective. Very typical, too, of the kinds of misrepresentations, because, as we'll see, you don't have to look far to find negative results from the consumption of GM foods by test animals. Here's the first quote on this site is a quote from a review that was published in 2009 called Health Risks of Genetically Modified Foods. It was a review of the toxicological data that had come out at that point, And the researchers stated the above results indicate that many GM foods have some common toxic effects. Too bad the Nobel laureates didn't know about that. And then another review that came out in 2011, these were both before Sheldon Krimsky's 2015 review. Many scientific data indicate that animals fed by GM crops have been harmed or even died. Again, that was a review of the research that had been done. Flies in the face of the kinds of claims we hear that there's been no harm documented. Now, the UK's Royal Society, the oldest and most prestigious, or one of the most oldest and most prestigious scientific organizations in the world, has been a great proponent of GMOs. And one of their statements that came out in a publication released in May 2016 is there has been no evidence of ill effects linked to the consumption of any approved GM crop. Well, actually there has. There has been such evidence. For one thing, a review of the data from 19 feeding studies on GE soy and corn varieties that comprise 83% of the GE foods that people have been regularly eating was published in 2011. Here are the findings, the main findings. 9%, now remember, these were foods that had already gone through the regulatory process and people have been eating usually many times, in many instances, for many years. 9% of the measured parameters, including blood and urine biochemistry and organ weights, were significantly disrupted in the animals that had eaten the GE food. And the greatest disturbances were to the kidneys of the males and the livers of the females. Now, the researchers emphasized that because the livers and the kidneys are, quote, the major reactive organs, unquote, in cases of chronic food toxicity, these results should be viewed as danger signs. Unfortunately, that was something the regulators in the EU and other countries hadn't done. They let these foods fly through and, onto the market. They didn't view those as danger signs. Now also, there was, speaking of no harm from shown associated with any approved crop, the most widely planted and widely consumed GMO crop of them all, Monsanto's Roundup Ready soybean, was subjected to rigorous long-term testing, 2 years. Most testing is either short-term or medium-term, which is only 90 days. 2-year testing, and the results produced 4 different published papers published in scientific peer-reviewed journals. And among the harms to the mice that were fed that soybean that were documented were disruptions to the functions of the liver and the pancreases, hardly minor inconveniences. Oops. So got ahead of myself there. Also, another genetically engineered crop that has been on the markets for many years and that hundreds of millions of people have been consuming. It was a variety of corn, or maize, more technically termed, but a variety of maize that Monsanto had produced to be resistant to Roundup. Okay, NK603 is the technical name of that variety. Now, a group of scientists in Europe subjected that GMO corn to long-term testing. Monsanto had gotten it approved based on a 90-day test, medium test. So they wanted to test it for 2 years and see what would happen. And they replicated what Monsanto had done, except they made the test more rigorous. They tested the corn as sprayed with Roundup. They tested the corn when it had been grown without being sprayed to see whether there was something perhaps in the genetic engineering itself that was problematic. And they tested the Roundup herbicide separately from the corn. They administered a dose of the herbicide in the drinking water of a third group of experimental rats at the same level, the same dosage that the rats would have received by consuming a normal helping of the genetically engineered corn that had been sprayed. Guess what? They found that all three categories of experimental rats suffered significant harm, all three. So the corn, when sprayed with Roundup, was found to be toxic to livers and to the kidneys. The corn, when unsprayed, was also toxic, and the Roundup on its own was found to be toxic. So not a very good, so of course, this study was soundly attacked. Roundly, I shouldn't say soundly because the attacks were unsound. It was roundly attacked, vehemently, viciously attacked, and not surprisingly, the attack was initially orchestrated by Monsanto, and with scientists that often will work front for Monsanto, and that have often been supported by Monsanto, and to give the illusion that they're independent scientists, though. But eventually other components of the pro-GMO scientific establishment took up the attack as well. Now, many scientists stood up for it. In fact, there was an open letter published by more than 140 scientists stating this research is solid and it deserves to stay published because the people doing the attack were trying to get the journal to retract the study so they could claim it was worthless and that it was no longer in the scientific literature. And after about a year of attacks, and also after the appointment of a former Monsanto scientist to the editorial board of the journal, a decision was made to retract the study. But there's some interesting points. First, that study was designed as a toxicological study. In the course of the study, it detected an abnormal rate of tumor growth within the experimental rats that were eating the GMOs or the Roundup. Now, the standard protocol in a toxicological study is if tumors are detected, they need to be reported. So they reported that there were tumors too. That's all they did. That was an auxiliary part of the study. But because the toxicological study was solid, the editor of the journal couldn't really base retraction on that data. In fact, he conceded that the toxicological results were reliable. But he focused on the tumor reports, and he stated that they were inconclusive, and therefore that the study had to be retracted. Well, as it turns out, inconclusive results is not a valid grounds for retraction. Okay? You can look at the standard criteria for retracting a study, and you won't find inconclusive results because many results are inconclusive, and yet that's news in itself. But the toxicological results were valid and they were conclusive. But what has been done? The scientific establishment has focused solely on the tumor results. They have pretended that the study was designed as a carcinogenicity study, and they say it was a flawed carcinogenicity study, and they've completely suppressed the fact that it was designed actually as a toxicological study, and it was a very sound toxicological study with very sound and troubling results. And even eminent institutions like the UK Royal Society, they play that game. Our National Academy of Science here in the US, they played that game. They have basically dismissed and disparaged that study. And here's the thing, in 2016, our National Academy of Science released a major report on genetically engineered foods, putting a happy face on them. And when it discussed that study, it basically stated again that it was unreliable, carcinogenicity study, inconclusive results, and it said, therefore, although the critics of GMOs claim that it shows that 90-day tests aren't long enough and that long-term 2-year tests are needed to adequately detect problems. It said, no, it doesn't show that. It shows 90-day tests are all right. When clearly the toxicological results did show that 90-day tests were not adequate to screen for all of the problems, that it often will take longer for the full toxicological effects to manifest. That's just scientific fraud, but it's happened. Now, the retraction of that article, it's been criticized strongly by scientists who understand what's going on and are independent of the push to, the push to promote GMOs. Here's one example, an article written by scientists. It was published in the Journal of Biological Physics and Chemistry in 2018, and it was entitled Retraction by Corruption, the 2012 Seralini paper. That was the paper that was retracted. Now, because that paper was solid, 5 other journals offered to publish it, to republish it, and so it was republished in 2014 in another journal, and it is currently, again, part of the scientific literature. But you'd never know that if you listen to the proponents. Now, I want to go through one more major misrepresentation by the UK Royal Society, claiming that the claims that have come out about problems were not about the GM method itself, but about the specific gene introduced into the crop, or about agricultural practices associated with the crop, such as herbicide treatments. Actually, that's false. And there have been a few studies that have clearly concluded that there was something about the process itself. In fact, the Royal Society is well aware of the main study because it was in the forefront of attacking it quite unjustly. And its attack, it tried to prevent that study from getting published. It was eventually published in the Lancet, a premier journal, in 1999, but even since it's been published, it continues to attack the study and misrepresent it. Its attacks, by the way, were so unjust that the editors of the Lancet rebuked the Royal Society for its breathtaking impertinence and its reckless disregard of the principle of due process. But that hasn't stopped the Royal Society. So they're claiming no study had shown that there was a problem with the process itself. Actually, that very study did. Because of the way it was controlled, the researchers concluded in their published article that the main problems that were detected in the rats were likely due to the process of genetic engineering itself. Oh. Now, the extent of the misrepresentations that have been propagated about GMOs by the scientific community are well summed up, I think, in this statement by Michael Antonio. He's a molecular geneticist with King's College London School of Medicine. And he has studied the research thoroughly. He's written about it. He's written a book about it, co-authored a book. If the kind of detrimental effects seen in animals fed GE food were observed in a clinical setting, the product's use would be halted and further research instigated to determine the cause and to find solutions. However, what repeatedly happens in the case of GE food is that despite increasing evidence of serious adverse health test results, government and industry continue unabated with the development, endorsement, and marketing of these foods as if nothing has happened, to the point they even seem to ignore the results of their own research. Now, I just want to move on and give you, initially at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that biological facts have been misrepresented as well to make nature look worse so that GM foods would look better. And here's one of the key examples. This comes from a report issued by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2004, trying to, they had to concede that genetic engineering can produce novel toxins that have never before been in the species, the target species. But then they claim, well, conventional breeding can do the same thing. But they couldn't cite any good example. Here's their example. Here, technical names. Basically, it was a wild variety of potato was crossed with a domestic variety, and they claimed that not only were the usual glycoalkaloids produced, but also the toxin dimethylidine, which they say is not produced in either parent. Then they stated, this singular result shows that non-genetic engineering breeding methods can have unintended effects and generate potentially hazardous new products. That's baloney. Okay, now, anybody here grow potatoes or know about potatoes? Dimethylidine is synthesized within all potatoes, almost all potatoes, as they grow. That's one of the reasons that you're warned against eating unripe potatoes. The thing is that when the potato has become fully ripened and is ready to eat, then the level of dimethylidine is pretty much nil. So it's false to state, as they claimed, and they claimed a few times, that this toxin was novel to the parents, had not been in either parent before. It had been in the parents as they were growing. So it's just false. It's flat out false. Whereas we do know that there have been completely unique novel toxins produced through genetic engineering. That is clear. And the National Academy of Science in that report went on to compound the deception by stating that the risk of the production of novel toxins is present any time traditional breeding is used. They're claiming that any time pollen-based breeding is used, there is a risk of unintended novel toxins. But that's false, clearly false. In fact, a paper that was published in Plant Physiology in 2013 by 8 experts stated, although breeders recombine tens of thousands of genes with virtually infinite potential interactions, to our knowledge, there has never been a report of a completely novel toxin or allergen appearing in a genus as a result of conventional breeding. Then they went on to state that they concluded that therefore the likelihood that any will occur through conventional methods, quote, is virtually zero. Quite a contrast with that statement, bold assertion by the National Academy of Science, and much more in line with the evidence. Now, the aggregate fraud, as my book demonstrates, the aggregate fraud that's been propagated, perpetrated by scientists and scientific institutions, if you put together all the various deceptions, misrepresentations, suppressions, it really stands as the biggest fraud in the history of science. And a fairly small proportion of scientists have been misleading the public and the rest of the scientific community. Most scientists are not involved. Many scientists will tell you they think GMOs are safe, but it's based on what they've heard people or institutions they respect say, and they have a right to trust them, but their trust, unfortunately, was misplaced. Here's a very telling quote from David Schubert, that professor at the Salk Institute, a molecular biologist who does understand the facts. I have spoken with many molecular and even plant biologists who are not directly involved in producing genetically engineered foods, and it's clear that most have been misled about the basic facts. For instance, they assume these foods have undergone rigorous safety testing, as in the case of drugs, and are surprised to learn that they haven't. Nor are they aware that the insertions of the recombinant cassettes are not precise, but random. Instead, due to the disinformation dispensed by the life scientists who practice and promote agricultural bioengineering, they have the impression that there are no unusual risks and that everything is under control. In most cases, after I've explained the key facts, they change their position. Now, Dr. Schubert has gone on to state, Some plant biologists are making statements about GE foods that they almost certainly know are not true. And that's a fair statement. That is in fact, it's about the only its truth has to be concluded when one has read all of the evidence, all of the deceptions. Probably you've heard enough already to see why that statement is true. Now, another thing that has happened Whoa, that works. Okay, I'll hold it back a little. Sorry if I hurt anybody's eardrums. But one of the other standards of science that's been badly broken is the fear that's been created within the scientific community to express concerns about GMOs. Scientists who do have concerns have been made afraid to express them. And those that have expressed them, who have done research that have shown problems, or who have in any way stood up and gone against this push to promote them, they often, if they don't have tenure, they've been denied tenure. If they have tenure, their offices and privileges have been taken away. If they're trying to get a job in the private sector, they don't get it. There's a major chilling effect that's permeated the scientific community. That again goes against science. The lifeblood of science is open, honest communication of the facts and disagreement and honest argument. That's how scientific knowledge gets refined. It's not happening in the case of genetically engineered foods. People are really afraid to speak out. And there's a telling quote from Philip Riegel, a professor emeritus of biology at the University of Minnesota. He stated, and he's been involved in the movement to try to get the facts of genetic engineering out there much more, and he's been very bold, and he's come under a lot of attack. He stated, traditionally, scientists regarded intellectual honesty as part of collegiality, and there was accountability if one was caught telling lies. Accordingly, liars were blackballed. But since the rise of genetic engineering, the situation of molecular biology has to a significant degree become inverted. And when it comes to that technology, one gets blackballed for telling the truth. And he could have added, and gets rewarded for twisting the truth, because many people who twist it keep rising through the ranks. We're not going to eat. That would have been in the next part. So I think it should be clear that, as I said, there's been a major fraud. Science has been badly attacked. And the differences between the attacks on science in regard to climate science and in regard to genetically engineered foods are very distinct, as I said. An external attack by forces hostile to science in the case of climate science, and an inside job, attack from science from within in the case of GMOs. And if we compare the situation of climate science and climate change and GMOs, we see, again, great contrasts, even though the proponents, as I mentioned earlier, want to equate any opposition to GMOs as similar to the attacks on climate science and the denial of global warming. But here's another very key distinction. In the case of climate science, the evidence, there has been hardly any, if any, evidence published in the scientific literature that goes against, that contradicts the consensus opinion that global warming, unusual global warming is happening, and that human activity is playing a significant role. As you've seen, in the case of GMOs, there's substantial amount of research evidence published in the scientific literature that goes against the standard claims that GMOs are no riskier than their conventional counterparts. Also, in the case of climate science, the main attack on climate science is coming, as I said, from external forces outside the scientific community, from major corporations and their allies in the political field and in the media and in some think tanks. In the case of and the scientific community has been staunchly resisting, standing against that attack. But far more ominous, in the case of genetically engineered foods, the key elements of the scientific community have been on the side of the major corporations and their allies, and they are making statements, misrepresentations, that are the same kinds of misrepresentations that the major corporations are making. They're defending the products of those corporations through the subversion of science. So it's a much more dangerous situation. And another major difference, as I'm sure you're all aware, in the case of the attack on climate science, any of the few scientists in the minority who are often allied with the major corporations, they get tremendous publicity. You can have consensus opinion and then a few scientists who say, no, we don't agree with that, and the media gives them a lot of attention. Or when fraud is alleged on the part of the climate scientists, that gets tremendous coverage. In the case of genetically engineered foods, where too many of the scientists who are promoting them actually have been committing fraud, hardly anybody is aware of that fraud. That's why I wrote one of the main reasons I wrote the book. So now you do understand that there has been a fraud, that genetically engineered, that there has never been a scientific consensus that GMOs are safe, and that there is good reason to make sure you avoid them and that those you love avoid them, because the risks have been well documented. And if you say no to GMOs, you are not going against science, you are actually aligning yourself with the facts and with our best scientific knowledge. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, in the time remaining, I will be happy to take questions, or I could go into what would be the next part of the lecture, if you would like. I'll let you vote on it. And that would be an analysis of genetic engineering from the standpoint of software engineering. And I will be happy, I can probably cover that in the next 12 minutes, or I'll be happy to take questions if I've said things that you want to talk about more. Continue? Okay, it's unanimous. At least unanimous from people who spoke up. So, it's very interesting. You might think, why is it relevant to not only examine the GMO venture from the standpoint of biological science, but to also look at it through the lens of computer science? Well, it's very relevant because when you think about it, both endeavors, both technologies, software engineering and genetic engineering, are making revisions to complex information systems. Our genomes, our DNA, is an information system. And in fact, DNA, the genomes of living organisms, are the biggest and most complex information systems on our planet. So, but they're far less understood than the information systems that software engineers are dealing with, because after all, they wrote those systems, right? But it's very interesting that genetic engineers have not, as relevant as software engineering is to genetic engineering, the genetic engineers have pretty much disregarded the hard-learned lessons of software engineering about the risks of altering information systems, the inherent risks. In fact, there's an entire chapter in my book on this called Overlooked Lessons from Computer Science, the inescapable risks of altering complex information systems, and they are inescapable. Now, let me just go through some explanation of what's being overlooked. Computer scientists have recognized that when software systems that they themselves write reach a certain level of size and complexity, and that's most of them now, they no longer can become fully predictable. It's impossible to make a fully guaranteed, precise surgical revision that won't create some unintended side effect or effects elsewhere in the system and cause components of the system to interact in unintended and potentially hazardous ways. That's well known, so well known, in fact, that the way that systems were being designed changed over the years to make them less interactive, to try to insulate various components of the system from one another to minimize the risks of unintended interactions. What software engineers tried to avoid is what they refer to as spaghetti code, where different instructions are so intertwined, they're like a mound of spaghetti. I think you've all had the experience of trying to suck on a strand of spaghetti or pull it out. It slithers and a lot of other strands start moving too. They want to avoid what they call spaghetti code. They want to try to write code in which the different instructions, the different components are more insulated from one another. What they aim to do is write what they call ravioli code. So they try to insulate different components much the way that the vegetables within packets of ravioli are isolated from one another. But they can't fully do it. So they've been able to write programs where the components more closely resemble ravioli than spaghetti, but they still are more interdependent, interconnected than any plate of ravioli has ever been. So human-designed information systems are designed to be linear. Those are the software systems. And by and large, they function in a linear manner. Although, as I've mentioned and as we'll emphasize more, they do become nonlinear unpredictably, in unpredictable ways. But in bioinformation systems, they are inherently nonlinear. By the way, linear means you do X wanting to get Y, and you're pretty sure that you're going to have the effect of Y. In a nonlinear system, you do X, not only will you probably get Y, you might also get Z or Q, okay? You can't fully predict all of the results of your actions in a nonlinear system. So bioinformation systems are inherently nonlinear. The genome is highly interconnected and coordinated. It's impossible, really, to make a precise change that won't have ramifications elsewhere within the within the cell. And they function in a highly nonlinear manner. Now again, in human-designed systems, spaghetti code is avoided. There's a minimization of interaction between different components. But in bioinformation systems, they are the ultimate spaghetti code. Unfathomable degree of interaction between the parts. In fact, software engineers have talked about what a massive spaghetti code the genomes are. They say it's kind of hard to understand how they even operate. Well, there's some level of organization, obviously, of which we are yet unaware, we human beings. We can't fathom it. Human-designed information systems, they are mind-made. The system's rules and dynamics are comprehended by those who make revisions. But in bioinformation systems, they're not mind-made, they're mind-boggling. As an eminent cell biologist at the University of California at Berkeley had stated very eloquently in some articles he wrote, Richard Stroman, who was a plaintiff, one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit I instigated, he stated that the ultimate rules that govern the bioinformation systems are beyond our understanding, that basically the rules are transcalculational, which he stated was just a technical term for mind-boggling. So revisions made by the biotechnicians are made with scant comprehension of what they're doing. Okay? in human-made systems, the people making the revisions know what all of the, they know the architecture of the system. Sorry, they know the architecture of the system. They know the intended interactions. In the case of bioinformation systems, they don't have that same level of knowledge. And yet, the changes, the interventions are far more radical than in the case of software engineering. Human design systems, the revisions are precise and minimally disruptive. In bioinformation systems, the revisions through genetic engineering are imprecise and highly disruptive. Human design systems, small revisions to life-critical systems. Life-critical systems are those that if they malfunction, if there's a bug in them, then human life could be lost, like an airplane guidance system or the software that runs a pacemaker or an X-ray therapy machine. So small revisions to life-critical systems are presumed to entail substantial risk. That's the standard presumption in the case of a life-critical software system. If there's any revision, no matter how small and presumably precise, it's presumed to have created disruptions that could lead to human harm, and there has to be rigorous testing. The regulators require it, it's the industry standard anyway, but in bioinformation systems, major revisions to life-critical systems are presumed to be essentially safe. Lacks requirements, lacks testing. Crazy situation. Well, and you might wonder, how is it then that bioengineers could be working, doing this? Well, first, they've disregarded the lessons of software engineering. In fact, many of them talk about how we're just operating like software engineers. They're tinkering around and making changes to information systems, and we're doing it too. And we know what we're doing, and so don't worry. They don't know what software engineers are doing, and they certainly don't understand the implications and the risks of what they're doing. They have overlooked those lessons. Now, one of the greatest ironies is one of the biggest boosters of genetic engineering, genetically engineered foods in special, is none other than Bill Gates. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has been pouring hundreds of millions of dollars that were earned through software engineering into developing a program that is violating the basic principles of software engineering. And I don't think he has made the connection. It's very interesting. Here we have money developed through software engineering that is violating the basic principles and procedures of software engineering by somebody who should know better but apparently does not get it. And it's I think that's one of the greatest ironies of all. And there are many ironies in the GMO venture. That has to be one of the biggest. And I like to think that if Mr. Gates, who was a brilliant man and an avid reader, were to finally get hold of my book and read it, there could be a major turnaround in his thinking and a major turnaround in the whole venture. Because if he spoke out, if he said, we're no longer going to proceed this way, if we're going to do any genetically engineered foods, they're going to have to go through really rigorous testing that's parallel to the kind of testing that is done in software engineering. But guess what? It's economically unfeasible to put genetically engineered foods through that level of testing. It would have to be at least the same kind of testing as for pharmaceutical drugs. And pharmaceutical drugs can be tested that way. It costs hundreds of millions, I believe, if not more, to test one of these foods, drugs, and get it on the market, because the manufacturers can get a patent and they can charge a lot of money for that drug to help recoup their expenses. But there's only so much you can charge for soybeans and corn and papaya. There's a limit to how much you can pay to do the testing. And that's why many experts have said the kinds of testing that are really needed could not be done. The biotech industry could not bear them, and it would collapse under the burden. So again, even more reason to regard the GMO venture as out of line with science, out of line with biological science, out of line with computer science, and therefore its products should be out of your kitchens. Thank you very much.